If you're like most brands, you're probably wondering where the supply chain is going, or if it's going anywhere at all right now. In this episode, we'll be looking at what might be next for the Asian supply chain. Welcome to A Seat at the Table. I'm Jane Singer, and today we're sitting down with Mark Hayden, Managing Director of Cato Overseas, the Hong Kong-based buying office for Cato Corporation. Cato is an American fashion retailer with over 1,300 stores in the U.S., offering a sweeping range of high-quality fashion at exceptional prices, including apparel, shoes, accessories, and even jewelry. Even in the face of the pandemic, Cato has stayed strong. At least part of that has to be attributed to Mark's skills in managing a complex supply chain. With over 3 decades of hands-on experience managing vast supply chains for multi-channel retailers in the U.S., EU, Australia, Russia, and South Africa, Mark brings a very educated point of view to the table. So who better to talk to at a time when we are facing challenges like growing pressure to diversify our sourcing, hard-to-predict trade tensions, and a global pandemic? Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
The supply chain is, a lot of people are calling it broken, but I don't see it broken. I'm actually quite amazed about how resilient it really has been. But the real pressure was back in 2018 with the U.S.-China trade war, and there was imposition of tariffs. And that, at that point, that looked like for many years as one of the bigger stresses on the supply chain. Perhaps that helped in a sense of dealing with the COVID, in that all supply chain players had to look at their supply chains, particularly those that were dominant in residing in China, had to be looking at how do we move out of China.
Right.
And so that process had already started in 2018. Then when COVID comes along in 2020, that in a way created a new set of problems. It wasn't so much dealing with China after China recovered. There was that whole shutdown of China, and
right.
No one expected it to spread the way it did. So that process continued to say, well, maybe with Chinese New Year and with COVID on us, we need to perhaps expedite a little bit more. And so that process continues. However, I think many of the companies have already had processes, internal processes, to deal with crises in the supply chain. So this is certainly by far the most extended period of stress on the supply chain. And for the most part, I think the supply chain has held up pretty well, because now what became a supply problem, certainly the focus is now on a demand problem.
Right.
I think supply chains have coped generally well, but we're not over this yet. This could be the eye of the storm, depending on where we are in the crisis. And maybe we are seeing the effects on the demand side where retailers are going out of business. The supply chain has been able to stand up to a supply issue of movement of your supply chain to other markets. We've never been tested like this, where I think suppliers have never been tested, where there's been just mass bankruptcies that are coming down the pipeline. Now, we had a financial crisis in 2008. You did have some, but nothing to this magnitude spread out among not just one market, but it's European retailers are going out of business, and Americans are going out of business, and South America on a worldwide. I'm not sure how many factory suppliers will be able to hold out if this continues.
Right. When you look at that and you look at the bankruptcies, most of those companies were really heading in that direction even without a pandemic. I mean, if you look at it, right, there's always reports about losses and more cutbacks and so forth. So the pandemic certainly speeded everything up. I mean, do you think that it would have been much different without a pandemic for these companies?
I think that, yes, they were. Many of the ones that are going under have been weak all along. However, prior to the COVID, we had really strong global economy, and certainly in the U.S., you had full employment. And so while retailers were working through their financial weaknesses, those bricks and mortar retailers who had overextended themselves, who had opened huge, they were going through this adjustment of reacting to the change in consumer preference. I think they probably would have had more time to work through that. But then when COVID hit and everyone locked down, and that was really sort of it was a nail in the coffin, and it was the final one where maybe there would have been a few more nails to be hammered in before the last final one came, right?
Right.
So it certainly accelerated, I think, the problems and magnified them.
Right, right. Yeah. You talked about e-commerce, and certainly, everyone's talking about e-commerce. When you look at it, and you look at, specifically apparel brands, it's often been said that apparel isn't doing a good job online. A lot of these brands haven't done much in terms of developing an online presence, because e-commerce has become a very big platform for people. But is that going to be the real game changer for our industry? Or do you think that there's other problems in that whether they're online or not, it's not going to save them?
Yeah, I think what's happening is even before all of it, e-commerce, very few companies made money on e-commerce. And while everyone talked about it, and you had to have a e-commerce presence, but it was many retailers were just looking at it, particularly with free shipping, returns, and all that. You just couldn't really make any money. So they were not jumping into this really enthusiastically. We're being dragged into it by, particularly if you're a public company and everyone's going, what are you doing on e-commerce? And all.
Right.
And then that spawned a lot of new companies to come into the e-commerce who were actually perhaps not burdened with the cost of having to carry brick and mortars at the same time. So they were also fed into this thing about e-commerce is the future. Well, they came in with a very different business model. I think they were much more flexible and nimble, and were able to do things much cheaper with the technology that was available, the digitization of with blockchain. And you looked at how some of these companies, if you look at Amazon, for example, they didn't have to follow a bricks and mortar sourcing and development of product model and try to apply it to e-commerce. You basically went into an online e-commerce mindset,
right,
and developed your product. So I think e-commerce probably did not do many retailers much of a favor in that they weren't able to do it cost effectively. They didn't get any not much financial returns on it, and they just didn't do it very well. Interestingly, with lockdowns and people spending so much time at home, I noticed just for our customer, who was an older customer who preferred actually to go shopping rather than sitting at home and buying their apparel online. But when you didn't have that option, our average age of our consumer is 50, just over 50 years old. That person then started shopping online because they were home with their teenage kids, and everyone's buying groceries online and buying. And they're noticing they became a lot more knowledgeable as well, that you could actually buy things pretty competitively online. They became better educated and more comfortable. So I think this will further give impetus to that whole e-commerce side as we emerge out of as COVID passes, and it will also force, I think, changes in how the bricks and mortars, they're not going to go away, but what's that experience, in-store experience, going to look like after this maybe a full year of dealing with COVID? How do you now deliver service in your stores?
Right.
Stores in China are doing a lot of interesting things technology-wise. You have customer service robots. You have you could do mobile checkouts. You could the whole payment system there. So it reduces that contact with staff. You don't need to be staffed as much. You have virtual dressing rooms and virtual mirrors and all of these things to really address that sort of perhaps health and safety concern, and also provide an experience. I think we may, in the U.S. and Europe, also be going in that direction.
Definitely. People will turn more to technology. Perhaps this has been a good thing because it's given, for lack of a better word, it's given brands cover to be able to unload a huge buildup, right, in bricks and mortar that was overstored even before the internet came to be, right? Back in, even in the 90s, they were talking about being overstored. And we didn't even have Amazon until, I think, 1998, right? And they were just selling books. Not surprising that right now brands are really struggling under this massive retail portfolio that's not performing.
Yes, and I guess the big question, and you sort of alluded to it before, is that all things will pass, and this will pass. Now, to what degree will this just become a distant memory and short memory? Because people really have very short memories when it comes to news and what's going on. One thing that's
Absolutely.
a disaster that goes on, it's forgotten a week later.
Yeah.
So, so hopefully it's not replaced by another infectious disease.
Oh, gosh.
But I think since we haven't seen the end of this yet, it's really hard to say how long that will linger in everyone's mind. I think retail will have to change. So that if retail changes, as we just talked about, the supply chain at the back end has to change.
Right.
The front end has to change, which drives the back end. Otherwise, the tail can't wag the dog.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to. So at the tail end of this, you do have to start looking about, I need now, as a retail business, I've got more e-commerce than I have, which means I have to turn things a lot faster. I have to probably do it cheaper. I may have to operate. Maybe I can't take those hefty margins that I took for years and years with the bricks and mortar. So how do we have a lean operation, the retail end of it? So they're going to be perhaps pushing even more services and work tasks overseas while they scale down, and we're already seeing it now, and I don't know if it's temporary, but the number of people that are being laid off, corporate offices and in product development and marketing, we're seeing out here in Asia, we're taking on additional responsibility. We're actually hiring people to do more on the tech area.
Right.
That means we also have to find suppliers who can similarly keep up with us in terms of our needs of faster product. We need more visibility. I think visibility and sustainability is definitely something that may come out of this. Maybe what comes out of this is a consciousness that we really didn't pay too much attention where the goods came from or how they were, is the virus a symptom, globalization and pollution that has gone on around the world that is now fostering these, increasing infectious diseases? How do we then go out and find responsible factories? And that changes, because before everything was just driven by price. Where do I get the best price? And you moved around markets trying to find the cheapest labor costs, right? Those are things I think will change. We need speed. We need transparency, because speed means that we want to keep less inventory near our stores. We want to be able to call the inventory, get it very quickly, rather than having, just as we just experienced, our stores were closed. We had so much product in the distribution center. Now, it would be better if those products were somewhere else and that we could call upon it quickly.
Yes, yeah, of course. And I think that what you had said earlier about consumers thinking more carefully about what they're buying, I mean, we're certainly seeing that come in through a greater demand for quality. I think before everything was just price. Is it cute and is it cheap? And now I think that even at a very young age, not teens per se, but certainly college age and up, there's a great awareness of quality. I'm surprised, when I talk to people of that age, how much they know about quality on things. And I'm like, wow, how do you know that?
Yeah. And you actually see it it is a lifestyle change. Yeah. And a lot of that is being communicated online, right?
Right.
So they're online shopping.
Speaking of the supply chain in China, that's been a hot topic, right, for almost 2 years now. First, we had the tariffs come in. Then we, of course, had this pandemic. So everybody's talking about moving out of China. But the thing is, you still rely on China for fabric, for raw materials. So if you're shifting to Vietnam or Cambodia or any of the other countries, have you really left China if you're reliant upon them for raw materials?
China has for 30 years, there's been this discussion about China and doing, too much with China. 20 years ago, it was a China plus one strategy.
Right.
It was after quota, quota basically moved things all outside of China. China had very little quota, right? And so It gave a reason for a lot of these others. When quota went away, there was a giant sucking sound, and everyone went to China because that was the most efficient place to make it.
That's right.
Because you had the entire supply chain there. And then as China started to change and the currency started to appreciate, it was like, it's no longer that cheap. we have to find some cheaper places that has cheaper CMT, and so everyone started moving out. But there was a lot of issues with execution and quality. Invariably, after going out for a year or two, everything would migrate back to China.
That's right. Yeah.
China continued to improve productivity, quality, where other countries did not do so well.
Yeah.
Part of the problem I also saw is this, it's not that difficult to set up an apparel factory. You just set up a bunch of sewing machines and, if you just want to just do a cut and sew operation. And so what happened is a lot of companies and factories I'm talking about, they were forced to move by their customers, right? So the brands tell us that I want to be out of this market because you're no longer competitive. Go to Vietnam, go to Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines. So the factory says, oh, okay, I guess if I want to keep you as a customer, I better do that. So they go, but they would ship them all these sort of old machinery and need to go and set up these factories. So what came out at the end of that production line was, problematic. It was slow. And so, one of the reasons, first of all, I think you have to look into the reason, why are we diversifying out of China?
Right.
Is it for ideological reasons? What is driving this move out of there? Is this trade war? And that could be very short-lived because I think everyone agrees that tariff was a horrible way to try to punish China, which had nothing to do with the stuff that they were exporting. The trade war was because of intellectual property issues and that. So, but this was the only way that the U.S. government at the time and currently could say, let's put tariffs on it. What that did was just hurt the U.S. retailers and consumers. I think with COVID now, there's going to be no room to add tariffs, even to use this anymore, because almost all retailers are in pretty serious financial problems.
That's right.
So what's going to happen? My guess is business pretty much stays in China.
Yeah.
To your point, even if you've moved out, okay, yes, you're using Chinese raw materials. You basically just changed the country of origin to another region. So to what end? Is it to avoid tariffs? Is it because, for political reasons, I have to follow the government? Is it cost reasons? Well, I mean, even the cost, there's the complexity of trying to manage a supply chain, which just not raw materials, it's the trims, it's the cardboard boxes, it's the logistics, it's the lead times, the shipping, all of that is quite an endeavor.
That's right.
So you haven't saved any time, and if we're talking about speed is important, you're not going to get that by moving out of China to one of these other markets.
Well, see, that's just it. I mean, if you're saving on the tariff, and right now we really haven't had tariffs on apparel just yet on most categories. We seem to be at the tail end that didn't come into being just before this pandemic. But assuming that we did have tariffs at some level, it's only one of the many costs. So if you have all your other costs are lower, or if you're making it up on speed, like you said, you're getting more speed out of China, therefore you're not having to carry as much inventory, is the cost of the tariff maybe in some way offset by that?
It is. So that's why I think about the only country that I've seen that could address that and is addressing it is Vietnam. Vietnam started earlier, mainly because of something, as you might recall, was called TPP.
Right. Yeah, everybody was gearing up for that, right? A lot of investment.
Right. And so you had a number of Chinese companies, basically, they're still Chinese in their nationality. They went and they set up cotton spinning and, right? So now you actually...
Yeah, a lot of mill investment.
Yeah, now you can actually, you don't have to rely on China to get that, where you've got Vietnam being able to do that. And from what I've seen is they're setting up state-of-the-art factories. Right?
Yes, that's true.
These are not using some rundown Chinese spinning equipment. These are really top of the line. They're spending a lot of money, and I think the money maybe is coming from the government that was supporting this. So this is the way to do it. So you have to be close to your raw material suppliers, and you have to have equipment that's state-of-the-art, that has high productivity, also down to the actual sewing as well, and there are a number of them. So that's why I think Vietnam is a winner, because they're going at it the right way. And, you're not giving up too much in terms of logistics time, shipping it from Vietnam to U.S. or to Europe.
Yeah.
So now that, I think it's always good to diversify your sourcing. You don't, let's just forget about tariffs or ideological political reasons. If you have so much in one market, it's not a really sound strategy.
Yeah, there's always a big risk there, no matter what, like you're saying.
Throughout the last 2 years of which I talked about, if you look at the fashion industry, very little moved outside of China, even with the trade war, even with COVID.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Because of this, there was no place that could really replicate. With fashion, you need small runs. You need to have speed, so you can't have these really high MOQs, which places like Cambodia and Myanmar and Indonesia all requiring. You need to be able to do small runs very quickly. Factories have to be, if they want to do the fashion piece of the business, they have to be nimble and be close to the raw material. So,
well, that's a good point that you're bringing up. Touching back on China, China has been, of all the big volume players in Asia, the one that's best adapted, right, to being able to do small orders and more complex garments. But I guess, at this point, there's going to be more pressure on everybody to be able to be adaptive to the demand from, as you said, from the brands and retailers.
Yeah, and how the factories pay workers, it varies by country and factories to a certain extent. Whereas in China, it's a piece rate thing. Whereas you go into, Bangladesh, India, they tend to be paying on a monthly, not so much on number of pieces that you're doing. So some of that also, in fact, affects productivity. That is also changing the supply chain.
Yeah. When we look at this whole supply chain need of having the raw materials near where you're making the garments, two other countries come to mind that do have domestic supply, which is India, of course, which has from fiber all the way through to garment making, but obviously for efficiency reasons has never really been able to go head to head with China. And of course, Indonesia has supply of materials as well. What do you see as the prospects for those two countries now that there really is demand on the supply side to diversify out of China into some place where you can get everything, materials as well as CMT?
This is another age-old debate between, like India. Let's go to India. And India, and many retailers go there and they just kind of find that the infrastructure there is still so poor,
right,
that you can't get speed, and you haven't been able to get that as consistent as China, though they do make good garments. The problem also is they're quite limited, and they're limited. They can't do man-made fibers very well, so any sort of non-cotton is all imported from China. So because they don't have a petrochemical industry to be able to do polyesters and all. So much of that in the fashion side. Yeah, they have the cotton. They could get it from Pakistan. They have their own. So they're cotton-wise they're okay, but they're not the market for everything. But maybe that's okay. You don't have to be. We in the supply chain are sort of used to that. It goes back to those quota days where who had the cotton quota, who had the man-made fiber quota,
right.
And then you manage your supply chain based on that. We manage our supply chain by. Okay, China does have all of that, so it makes your life easier. But if government, regulations make that difficult, we'll just have to adjust. You start doing more of your cottons in the India market, but you have to, and they're great in the product development side.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And they have factories that can do, because they tend to be smaller, mainly, actually this is more because of government reasons there, that big factories, they went to Bangladesh because of have to have a union if your factory is over X number of people. So India didn't want to have to be unionized, so they went to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has the big factories,
right,
that India hasn't been able to do. So in a way, I think India could be a beneficiary of COVID, but they're having a horrible time right now.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
With COVID. It might take some time. I think they've been set back because of this. as we then start looking for other markets, saying, "Oh, it was like really bad. I really need more consistency in another market." That's why suddenly Indonesia is jumping on everyone's radar.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, what's your take on Indonesia?
We do some Indonesia, but I think it's probably worth another look because it certainly on paper it's always looked very good. It's got a very large population and it's young. They do have raw materials there, though it's limited. I think it's something that it's worth exploring in terms of what is their mill capabilities these days than what it was before. But certainly a lot of people are looking to that market. We get good product out of there from the factories we work with.
I'm just wondering if, because people are being incentivized to diversify into these nations, if that will help, if they'll be pulling up some of these nations, because in a sense, a lot of what pulled up China and, even in the old days, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, was the standard set by the foreign buyer that the factory then had to try and meet in order to get the order. And so that was sort of a win-win for everybody in the long run.
Yeah, but I think that if that's the case, it would have happened already. Now, why hasn't it happened? I think a lot of it has to do with the China price.
Right, true.
China, when everything went to China after quota, the China, and it's not so much the Chinese problem, it's really the brands who have just continued putting pressure, and the prices. If you look at the price of a blouse that you do today versus you did, 15 years ago, it's less now than it was then. So I think a lot of these business people and factory owners in Indonesia, Thailand, look at that going, there is no way I can make any money competing with China. I'd much rather sell to the domestic market where I've got a higher price, and I'm in a country like Indonesia with over 200 million people. There is a whole market there. I have a large enough domestic market, and I could sell higher price in the local market than exporting. So why do I need all of the aggravation, perhaps, or make less money on the export side?
But how is the China price? On the one hand, it's like, okay, the China price is very low. And on the other hand, people are moving out of China, trying to get into other countries because China's gotten too expensive.
Yes, but they've gotten too expensive because they've been so used to having they're anniversarying these low prices, and it's not that. So what they got, China moves up. When high price, when you're talking to retailers, that could mean 20 cents.
Right.
An increase, and they're going, oh my God, how retailers are. It's like, oh, these buyers, at 20 cents, they get me out of China, get me to another market. Let's go to India, Bangladesh. They're really cheap. But I think that is also the psychology, and it's still that China is they say is too expensive, but they haven't successfully been able to develop any of these businesses in other markets in a really big way to compete with China. At the end of the day, I think they'll go, I'll go back, I'll still pay that extra 25 cents now because I'm going to get my products on time and in really great quality. And some of these other markets, until recently, as I said, Vietnam is one. So we are seeing some of these markets, and you're right, it will bring up those exporting countries that get government assistance. That's what made China, a lot of, there were state-run companies in the beginning. There were some subsidies. If you export, you got some of this back. It takes a government, sort of like what Vietnam is doing, to actually want to and capable of investing, assisting the manufacturers. Many of these other countries are not. They're just sort of leaving it up to the manufacturer themselves, and they're not getting much assistance in taxes or land prices. China, so many, they would get almost virtually free land, or they didn't have to pay tax on it. They had tax holidays. So they were able to, right off the bat, start being very competitive. Are the governments of Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, are they doing the same? Is the question mark.
As you had said earlier, in China they have the advantage that the government has made a massive investment in infrastructure, and that's helped every industry. I think that take a step back, maybe a year or two, we'll see that this whole COVID situation was more of an extraordinary event that took out a big chunk of business. And the bigger picture really is going to be, as you're saying, how do you manage your supply chain in a market where people want things faster and they want more agility and so forth?
Yeah, I think the run-up to November is going to be very rocky between China and Europe and the U.S. And, us sitting here in Hong Kong, we've kind of seen that.
That's right.
It's going to get ratcheted up. And I don't know if it's going to impact trade as we know it now. So, it's quite possible it will go even further. So we may need to, despite the efficiency and price and everything of China, have no choice but to try to develop a fashion business in a market that's not geared up for fashion.
Right.
And so it's going to be, I think the next 6 months is going to be extremely tough for anybody who's working in China.
It certainly looks like the current situation in sourcing is going to remain quite complicated. Mark, thanks so much for sharing your views.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
What's your biggest supply chain challenge? Please let us know in the comments section. If you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table, please subscribe to our podcast, where you'll get to hear from some of the industry's leaders and innovators. And if you're looking for an easier way to keep up to date on sourcing shifts, new technologies, supply chain strategies, emerging markets, and of course e-commerce, head on over to our website, insidefashionlive.net. and consider subscribing to our weekly newsletters. You'll also find all of our contact information there. Please feel free to contact us with any ideas, suggestions, or questions. That's insidefashionlive.net.